Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am delighted to welcome you all to this presentation by the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that the land on which we are gathering today is the traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation and their people. And I also want to acknowledge that some of you will be joining us from both near and far, and I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners, past and present, of those lands as well. My name is Joan Batorf, and I am Director of the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention and a professor in the School of Nursing here at UBC Okanagan. And we are really delighted to have this presentation today. It comes at an ideal time in our calendar of the year. It's not only Indigenous History Month, and our webinar today is focusing on young Indigenous men, but it's also Men's Health Week as well across Canada. And because we're focusing on men today, again, it's really an excellent fit with both of those opportunities to recognize the importance of Indigenous men and their health. And that's exactly what our topic is today. And so before we begin, I just want to let you know that the closed captioning box at the bottom of your screen can be really moved to your preferred place by just dragging it to where you would like it. You can also turn off the captioning if you like by selecting the live transcript button on the menu bar and turning it off. We welcome our webinar guests to type questions or comments into the chat box at any time during the presentation. We'll read out the questions at the end and invite discussion and comments from our panel. Today's session is entitled, as you can see, Digital Wellness Project for Young Indigenous Men, Preliminary Results from a Community-Based Participatory Project. And I'm really delighted to welcome my UBCO colleagues and students to our webinar today. And I'm going to introduce first Lim King, who's a master's student here at UBCO, and he's going to lead us off and also introduce the panel. So over to you, Liam.
Thank you, Joan, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. My name's Lim King. I'm the master's student who ran this project for their master's thesis. I'm very honored to be here today to talk about this project. This is the first time we've had an opportunity to present on it since running it. So this will be the preliminary results from our thesis. And yeah, so I'm excited to be here during Men's Week and during Indigenous History Month. With the other group members who ran the project with me and my two supervisors who have helped develop the project and get it going. So before we go into introductions of each of our research team members, I would first like to draw your attention to the picture on the front of this PowerPoint. And so this picture speaks to the theoretical framework of our study. And it speaks to how colonial society has typically represented Indigenous men in ways to appease settler audiences. So specifically, it appears this image here was inspired by early drawings of Chief Matatope, who was a Mandan chief who was alive in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And Chief Matatope, otherwise known as Forebears, was drawn a number of times from colonial artists George Catlin and Carl Bottomer. And these images were typically imbued with qualities that align with colonial interpretations of masculinity, as opposed to traditional Indigenous understandings of masculinity. And so this is an important concept in this project where we were looking to understand the ways that digital media use influence the identity of young Indigenous men. And so, yeah, and So when Indigenous identities are misconstrued through the colonial mindset, as is evident in the early drawings of Chief Matatope, and unfortunately I couldn't get copyright to show those images today, but this one, if you go and look at images of Chief Matatope, is clearly inspired by it. And so what happens is when the colonial mindset makes representations of Indigenous men and Indigenous peoples more broadly, it can often result in the homogenization of our identities into a singular and static form that often plays up to the noble savage trope. And that is evident in this picture here. By the positioning of the subject and the ways that when Indigenous men represent themselves, the stark contrasts in the representations that Indigenous men create about themselves, as opposed to the representations that are often found in media and the way that are made through the colonial mindset or through mindset not of Indigenous. And so the staging of these subjects was created to reinforce the understanding of Indigenous peoples' primitivity through their representation of being on the brink of extinction and being stuck in the past. And so this justifies settler colonialism as it becomes a self-evident truth that Indigenous peoples will not survive, and therefore their elimination does not place an onus on settler society. So this dynamic is evident throughout the history of settler colonialism and results in misunderstandings of Indigenous men's identities that permeate into contemporary society. So that's just a little bit about the theoretical framework from which this project was created, and then I'll go into that a little more later on. And I think this image is a very good example of how these identities can be misconstrued. So going forward. So first I'll go through the agenda today. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the introduction to our research team. So each presenter here will introduce themselves. And then we're going to go through the research project quickly, just an introduction to the project, which I've already done a little bit just now. And then we're going to talk about the project design and the community partners, our conceptual and methodological frameworks. And then we're going to do a mini sharing circle. We're going to do a mini sharing circle that's going to encompass the group member sharing at the end, where we're going to ask questions from the group members who are here today. So one part of the project is it was participatory. So each of the group members that are typically called participants had the opportunity to join us today to be a part of the presentation. And so 3 of the group members were able to make it today. And we're going to do a little circle at the end just with questions to talk about the results that came from the study. And then we're going to do our conclusion. So that will be after. So we're going to do introductions in the order of the pictures here. So I'll start first. Hi, everyone. My name's Lim King. I'm a Cree Métis master's student in the Health and Exercise Sciences Department here at UBC Okanagan. My Indigenous family permeates from the areas of Prince Albert and the Red River, and then prior to that, Cumberland Cree House and areas associated with that. I grew up in Montrose and the West Kootenays in British Columbia, and I now live in Vernon with my partner and my 2 young children. And yeah, and I'm 30 years old. So I'm gonna move it off to Ali, can do her introduction next.
Hi everybody, my name is Ali McManus. I am a professor in the School of Health and Exercise Sciences. I have a passion in research around trying to understand the role being active plays in the health of children. And I first partnered with Liam in a school-based project examining how much Kelowna youth use digital media and whether that affected their physical or psychological health. So this is a really nice continuation of a theme, but it's been a real privilege and pleasure to work on this project. And I've learned so much from, and I think continue to learn from my teammates and also particularly the participants. So very nice to be here today. And I'm not going to tell you my age.
Kia ora tātou katoa, ko Braden te Hiwi taku ingoa, he Māori a hau hiri au no ngā te raukawa. I guess good afternoon, although I'm not sure if others are in different time zones. I was born and raised in Aotearoa, which is a small nation in the South Pacific, also known as New Zealand, and I come from the west coast of the North Island in a community there called Ngāti Raukawa. I am a faculty member in the Indigenous Studies program at UBC's Okanagan campus, where I live on the unceded traditional territory of the Seal people. I guess my role in this project is probably one more of a leadership or mentoring and guiding one. I think that Ellie and I kind of took that role. And so that's just a little bit of my position in the group. And I like the idea that we're all presenting here as a group. It's quite important to me. And so I really do like that. But just want to be clear on the different kind of roles, with kind of Liam at the center and Ellie and I are supporting, and then also some of the group participants, which is really awesome. I do want to make a couple of acknowledgements. Firstly, to CIHR for their financial support. So I want to thank them. I want to thank you all for tuning in today, which is wonderful, and I do look forward to our conversations later on. To Dr. Bortoff for the invitation. To Aboriginal Programs and Services at UBC Okanagan for their important support, and just to the rest of the team here in general. So that's me. I'll pass it on to the next one.
Hi there, my name's Adrian Mosselaer. I was one of the group members in this study, and I'm traditionally from the Secwepemc and Cree Nation. Grew up in Golden and Kelowna, and I'm in my second year nursing, so it was really interesting to take part in this project and discover other like-minded individuals who were maybe curious about how digital wellness does affect Indigenous men, and see where that discussion took us, which was a really nice and healing environment that was safe, and a place where I'm very grateful for UBCO and Lim King to put this together, because it was really interesting to be a part of. So thank you for attending, and I'll pass it along.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mitchell Barrett. I'm an engineering student going into my 4th year, and I'm specializing in mechanical engineering. I currently work at the university through the Aboriginal Undergraduate Research Mentorship Program, which Liam King also participated in his undergrad. I work in a material science lab, working on high chromium steels for mining applications. I live in Kelowna, BC currently, and growing up here as well. I'm 20 years old, and I identify as Métis, and it's just been a pleasure to work with Liam over the last few months and be a part of this group in this research.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending. It's great that everyone's made it. My name is Quinn Mosselaer. I am Secwepemc and Cree. I was born in Golden, BC, and currently going into my 2nd year of nursing at UBCO. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to be a part of this project. I've learned lots, and it's been very healing, and I got to understand more about my Aboriginal culture. So it's just been very great for me. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for doing the introductions. I just want to acknowledge our other group members that weren't able to make it today. And so the other group members that weren't able to make it were Asher, Ethan Watkinson, and Ty Watkinson. So they were the other 3 group members that were a part of this project. And so I've prepared a quick quote from each of them to answer one of our questions for our round table. So they'll get to participate in that way. So I've kind of taken a sample of our results from them, and I'm going to speak to that later in this presentation so that they can be a part of it, even though they weren't able to make it today to be here live. So then I'm going to pass it off to Braden for the project and statement of problem.
Great, thanks, Liam. And so, digital media is a significant part of our lives. And in particular, the youth have taken up this space with particular and significant interest. It shapes how youth interact and communicate with one another, how they think about themselves, and how they engage with the world. And in many ways, they're important drivers of media use and content. And this particular project was driven a lot by Liam, and also had some origins with some work done by School District 23, which is the local school district in the Okanagan, which is in BC's interior. And they had developed some materials and some work with their students, high school students, to support them to be safe and healthy when using media. And we found what they did was quite interesting and really quite good. Yet there was no voice or no space provided for how Indigenous youth perspectives, experiences, or Indigenous knowledges could inform that type of work, or how that curriculum and work could address the needs of this specific group. And so that was much of our early conversations, and this took place in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and because of that, the school district just couldn't work with us at that time. They simply had too much going on. But we really thought there was a real importance in this work. We got that feedback from the school district. And so we continued to work with the same broad principles, but instead to work with university students, primarily in their early 20s. And so at that point, we began to partner with the Aboriginal community on the campus in the Okanagan here, the university campus, and in particular with Indigenous students. So we hold the belief that a person's identity is relevant to their well-being, and experiences with digital media can affect how someone constructs, reaffirms, or affirms their identity. Specifically here, we were looking at Indigenous identities, which are important in terms of that they can both shape media use and are shaped by media use. And more specifically still, we looked at masculinities and masculine identities. And so there was a significant gender lens that we took with the project, recognizing that gender was very important to both well-being and to identity. And there really is not a lot of work that's been done in this area. And so we felt there was a real need for this. And so we kind of entered this project with an eye to establishing a starting place for Indigenous men as they engage with media. And so our goal really by bringing together masculinities, health, and Indigenous youth was to create a starting point for understanding how we might support youth in having fun, in learning, being productive, being safe and responsible when using media. I wanted to make a quick note too about colonialism And so for us, this is the single largest overarching threat to Indigenous people's well-being. It's a pretty broad term that encapsulates a lot, you know, from the confiscation of land, the removal of children from their families, economic marginalization, and much more. And as Liam alluded to earlier, we kind of paid specific attention to the ways in which colonial ideas inform the representations of Indigenous peoples in the media. And so historically, Indigenous peoples have had, you know, very little or an absence of their voice and perspective. And that still has effects today, although currently there is an important digital Indigenous voice, but that on the whole, it is still fairly limited and relatively small. Yeah. Maybe I'll leave, Liam already expanded a little bit on that. So maybe if you want to click on to the next one, Liam, I'll move on to the next slide. So we wanted to engage and work with Indigenous youth who identified as being men and with masculinities to better understand how they engage with the media and to do, you know, some listening and some learning about their perspective. And whilst we were kind of very aware that Indigenous representations are too often colonial and racist, and that has real impacts on our well-being, at the same time, the media did present an opportunity where there could be, you know, supports and a reaffirmation of Indigenous identity. And so we created 3 questions to drive our work. The first one, how do young Indigenous men use digital media? This was a largely kind of descriptive type question to get a sense of what media meant and how often they used it and so on. The following 2 questions were ran much deeper. The second one asking about digital media's effects on identity. And then the third one, how do young Indigenous men think interactions between their identity and the digital world affect their health and wellness? And so these are the ones that we use to guide the project and the focus of the work. And an important part of that work was the community-based approach that we took. And so I'm just going to pass it on to Ali, I think, who will be speaking about that next.
Thank you, Braden. And as Braden said, the main idea originally for this project came from our original work with the school district and the learning technology team, who had created a digital wellness curriculum. And there's a nice parallel. They had used design thinking, where the students themselves had created the ideas and the framework and the main tenets of that curriculum. And it was very important, as mentioned already, that we try to develop an Indigenous lens around digital media and what that meant to identity, particularly for young men, and how that affected their wellness. And for that reason, this project uses this community participatory approach. And that simply means that instead of participants being passive objects in the research process, which is often the case, we come in and we simply collect data, instead they are actually central to the project. They are placed at the center because they create both the agenda and the knowledge of the project. And as a community participatory research project, of course, we had a community partner, and our partner was very important to us, the Aboriginal Programs and Services based at UBCO. The APS represent Indigenous students at UBCO, and for that reason, they offer a culturally familiar, safe research space for students, and particularly for students to understand and engage in research. And they became our gatekeepers, as it were. So were kind of our first level of partnership. The second layer of partnership, of course, is the young Indigenous men who joined this project. And as I said, they represent the project. They created the agenda with Liam and very much created the knowledge that we're now going to share with you today. And really pleased that some of them are joining us here today.
Thank you, Ali. So I'm just going to quickly speak to the lens that was used to create the study and also to analyze the data from this study. And so it's what I've termed a critical Indigenous gender lens, and it consists of theories from Indigenous feminism, Indigenous queer theories, and Indigenous masculinity theories. And I've just referenced a very short list of a few articles that were used for the study from those fields. And so typically colonialism was investigated and theorized about, and it wasn't where gender wasn't brought into the picture. So originally, a lot of theorists like Frantz Fanon and Albert Memmi, they would investigate colonialism and do really good work with it and get really deep into it, but they wouldn't investigate gender and the way gender identities played into the role of colonization. And so Indigenous feminists started to analyze the way colonialism was a gendered process through which Indigenous identities and gender identities and expressions were disrupted and displaced as a strategic tactic in the settler colonial project, or through colonialism more broadly. And so combined, these three sets of theories speak to the ways that Indigenous women, two-spirited peoples, and men, how their traditional Indigenous identities have been disrupted and displaced through colonization. And this happened through throughout history in many ways, and is evident when analyzing the history of colonialism. At first, it happened through very violent acts that were meant to eliminate gender diverse people in Indigenous societies. And then that later culminated into legislative practices, and specifically in Canada, legislation such as the Indian Act, which took Indigenous children away from their families, put them in residential schools, and was meant to replace traditional Indigenous understandings of identities with understandings of identities that were rooted within the colonial mindset that saw gender as binary and saw men as dominant to women. And so these theories speak to how that was central to colonization and the ongoing process and ongoing structure of settler colonialism. And specifically, I've related it to Canada. And so with the Indian Act, it's evident in that the men were given, Indigenous men in Canada, were given more, their children were lost status less easily. So Indigenous women's children could lose status more easily, and that still continues today, where the Indian Act favors a patrilineal line of descent. And so what that does is it disrupted our traditional kinship systems and replaced them with kinship systems that more closely resembled colonial structures than our traditional ones. And that includes the nuclear family and conjugal family structures. And so that was done to weaken Indigenous societies in order to be able to remove us from the lands and complete the project of settler colonialism. Or not complete because it's ongoing, but to allow that process to take place. So that's very briefly the critical Indigenous gender lens. And so the Indigenous methodologies, this study was imbued with Indigenous methodologies, and Indigenous methodologies are informed by the holistic, fluid, relational, and spiritual aspects of Indigenous epistemologies. And so the way gender was understood prior to colonization was in relation to these holistic, fluid, relational, and spiritual aspects of our worldview. And so another way of saying epistemologies is worldview. And so to align with that, we used an Indigenous storywork methodology. And so Archibald 2008 created the Indigenous storywork methodology that honors story as valid pieces of evidence, which fits with our traditional oral knowledge systems as Indigenous peoples. And so she designed the 4 R's. She recreated 4 R's to mean respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and then she added reverence at the end. And so those concepts were used to guide the treatment of group members or so-called research participants in the running of research. And so those were 4 tenets that were imbued into this study in order to respect our group members. And that works very closely with the community-based participatory research approach. And so the last 3 tenets that Joanne Archibald spoke about in her later book in 2019, where she speaks about how holism, synergy, and interrelatedness can be used to guide data analysis. And so those concepts relate to Indigenous epistemologies. And so those were used as a foundation of our data analysis to respect the holistic, synergistic, and interrelated nature of Indigenous knowledge. And so the methods we took to accomplish this was that we used research sharing circles, and which also fit with the oral knowledge systems. And so a research yarning approach was employed during the research circles. And the research yarning approach allows for both individual and collaborative meaning making. And it was a research technique that was designed specifically for use with Indigenous youth and Indigenous knowledge systems. And so with the research yarning, there's research questions that are created, but yet it's still very unstructured, and it allows for conversation to flow in the way that it's going, and it allows for the group members to contribute their own experiences and knowledge without being overly structured, but yet it has questions to guide the research so that you are still speaking about a topic and you're still speaking to a certain question, but it's about allowing the conversations to go where they need to go at that time, and then using those questions to bring it back to the topic if necessary. And so then to collect the data, to actually collect it, we used audio recording and transcription. So we audio recorded all of our group sessions. So what we did was we met in a group in a sharing circle. It was me and the 6 group members, and we met weekly for 6 weeks. And then we took 2 weeks off, and then we met one more time for data collection. And we just talked about the topics that were brought up from the theoretical framework and the using the sub questions created to answer those original research questions. And then I also want to note at this point that we also did have an elder join us, Elder Grouse Barnes. So he joined us for our 5th session. And he provided teachings about what it means to be an Indigenous man from his traditional Seal perspective. And so then that was also used as a piece of reciprocity for our group to learn, to have conversations with a traditional knowledge keeper and get knowledge from traditional Indigenous systems, knowledge systems. So at this point, as long as Braden or Ali don't have anything to add, we're going to move into our group sharing. So what we're going to do is we're going to run the mini research sharing circle, and I've just created some questions, and this is going to be a way for us just to converse about the results coming out of this study. And so the results are the experiences of the group members. And so for the results, we simply created some questions, and we're just going to talk about the group members' experiences who were able to make it here tonight. And as I mentioned, I've created one quote, or prepared one quote from each group member that couldn't make it to answer a question. So we're going to do the group sharing. So I'll start with Adrian right now. We'll start that order first, and then we'll mix it up as we go. What was your initial motivation or interest in this study?
Great question. I think what it came down to is ultimately where the discussion would take us, just what it was going to look like and what that group was going to be when the discussion was around digital wellness and Indigenous men. Ultimately, I had my idea of how I use digital media, and I guess it was just sort of this curiosity of exploring that a bit deeper to see maybe the impacts of other Indigenous men and just maybe some relationship between the other guys in the group. So I thought it was kind of interesting to see this this project happening and the opportunity to take part in it. I just thought there'd maybe be some neat learning. So I thought the curiosity got the better of me for sure.
Great, thank you, Adrian. Mitchell, would you mind answering next?
Yeah, for me, it was probably just a new overall experience of his main thing, because I'm in engineering, so I don't really get these opportunities very often. And a lot of it, if it's not engineering related, I usually don't have any participation in it, as well as connect more with Indigenous men at UBCO, because also again in engineering, less than 1% of engineers in Canada are Indigenous. So I felt like it's always important to connect more with Indigenous men outside, as well as more of the Indigenous community at UBCO, because probably in the last 3 years I've been at UBCO, I can count all the Indigenous men I've connected with, or Indigenous men students I've connected with, on like a single hand. So now with this group, I can count it on 2 hands now. Yeah, so just mostly just connecting as well as new experience.
Great, thank you, Mitchell. Quinn?
Yeah, for myself, with COVID, it was nice to have a group to go to and to see other students. I mean, you get to see them in class, but that's only for class time. So this was kind of a nice way to have a discussion with other Indigenous men and talk about our Indigenous culture. For myself, especially right now, and even before the research, I was kind of questioning my Indigenous culture and what I really know about it. Growing up, I didn't really have much influence. Well, I just have some on my mother's side. My father is from European descent, so it was hard to kind of get that Indigenous culture teachings. So this group was really good for that. And yeah, just seeing how other young Indigenous men feel and making me feel like I wasn't alone. So it was really beneficial for myself.
Great, thank you for that insight, Quinn. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that about the not growing up knowing much about your culture. That's definitely something that drove me to create a group like this and create research like this to try to understand that dynamic a bit more. Yeah, for sure. So our next question was, what was the most beneficial about the group for you? And so this time I'm going to start with Mitchell, if we don't mind.
Yeah, no problem. Probably the most beneficial thing for me would definitely have to be having the actual group sessions themselves, like kind of like why Quinn joined, just to have the group sessions. That's probably the most beneficial thing I have. As mentioned, yeah, by everyone who participate during the group sessions, that it was good to have just a group that you can relate to from a cultural background, even though we're all from different Indigenous ethnicities and nations and stuff like that. You still have like that shared Indigenous heritage, even like kind of like you can see the viewpoints come through. Like I think the participants shared a lot of viewpoints on a lot of things, and I'm not sure if that's like an Indigenous thing or Indigenous men thing or just a man thing that like those viewpoints came through, but it was I feel like it helped with the relatability and just able to connect more with the group. And I think it just helps your mental stability, especially during COVID, because you just need that human interaction, because humans are social animals, so kind of just need that, and that was probably the most beneficial.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of the Indigenous cultures in North America and in Canada do share themes, right? Underlying themes. So if we make these, when we think broader, there definitely is those connections we can make, even though it can come across pan-Indigenous in instances, but it is still important to bring us together and see the commonalities, differences between our cultures. It definitely provides opportunities for meaning making. So great, thank you for that. Quinn, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Well, from the beginning, Liam, like was said earlier, it was really an open research. It was really left to us to kind of decide the path of what we're going to talk about and when we're going to be meeting. So it was really nice that way to kind of, like I said earlier, it was like a discussion with young Indigenous men. So that was really beneficial for myself just to talk it out, and it didn't really feel like a research. It just felt like a talk with a group of friends. So it was nice to get together every week and talk about our Indigenous ways. And one of the group members had a tattoo, talk about that. And yeah, it was beneficial in that way. In terms of digital media, Liam kind of left it to us to keep an eye open. He didn't say, go research this and see what you can find, or so I never really thought about that, thinking about what I see in digital media for Indigenous men. And you see a bit, but definitely it can be improved. So but once you keep an eye out, you can kind of start to see the path and see more sites that so that's kind of what I found for myself.
Great, thank you for that, Quinn. Adrian?
Yeah, no, it was most beneficial. I think probably what it comes down to for myself is the ability to connect with other Indigenous men. It was neat that it was on a digital platform, and still how that actually tied into overall our wellness as a group, because we showed up every week, and a lot of times, sometimes you're a little more chatty one week, other weeks you're a little quieter depending on what's going on, but you felt motivated, at least for myself, I felt motivated to be there, to be present, and to respect everyone's conversation and dialogue. And then ultimately, I think what was really most beneficial was just having the opportunity to sit with the elder. I think that provided even through the digital platform, it was very healing to just have his attention and his presence in the room, if you will, to kind of just chat with us. So found that to be really really nice and beneficial, to bring an interesting component to the group and ultimately to myself. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Adrian. And at this point, I'm gonna read a quote from the results from Ethan Watkinson, because I think it speaks to this question. And so Ethan said, when asked about what was it about having a group of young Indigenous men that was beneficial, he answered, this has been like really nice for me personally, because there's been these underlying thoughts I've been having about being an Indigenous man that I haven't had quite the right place to just share with others about my viewpoint. And this study has been a great place to not vent, but just kind of unload on, you know? So this group just kind of provides a nice little common ground, if you will, for everyone just to speak their mind about these subjects regarding Indigenous personality and manlyhood, if you will. Again, thanks for hosting this type of environment. And so I think that quote from Ethan speaks to this question. And yeah, so I'm just going to answer for Ethan in that case. And I have one more each for Asher and Ty. Okay, so we're going to go to the next question. I think so. We're going to skip over this question because we did just kind of answer it. Everyone talked about it's nice to have a young Indigenous man in a group. So at this point, I think this one might be a little repetitive. So I'm going to slip past that one. So the elder Grouse came and visited us for one of our sessions and provided teachings about what it means to be an Indigenous man from his traditional Okanagan perspective. So why did you want an elder to join us for the group? So that was something that I proposed to the group, was whether or not they wanted an elder to come. And so all of our group members spoke to how they would want an elder to come. So that's where this question comes from, because that was part of our participatory approach. So Quinn, do you want to start with this one this time?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it was certainly an honor to have Elder Grouse join us. It was actually quite difficult to find an elder. They must be busy people. But once we did, it was definitely an honor. And it was nice because, like I said earlier, I didn't really have much elders to go to growing up. So just to have him there for that session to explain to us what it meant to be an Indigenous, male Indigenous man really helped me. Even though we're talking about two kind of different scenarios, him growing up back in the day and then now. But it was certainly interesting to hear what he had to say. And I would say it definitely relates to now. He talked a lot about connecting with nature, how we're a culture that loves one another and takes care of one another. And we like to laugh. He talked about healing ways of Indigenous people and how we can cope with hard situations. So it was just really helpful for myself to hear that and to actually practice some of that. And yeah, that's kind of what I enjoyed about having Elder Grouse here. And he was really welcoming. He actually invited us to come to his home and have a sweat with him. So might have to take him up on that. And yeah, hopefully I get to meet him in person one day.
Yeah, he was very open and warm and accepting. And he did say that a few times, I think, before everyone caught him, like, oh, he's offering for us to go to his house for that. Oh, that's such an honor, right? Like, so that was truly, yeah, a blessing. And I can't even, like, I've been, ever since our session with Elder Grouse, he's constantly in my mind too. And that was kind of what inspired my shirt today. And I'm going to go down with my sweetgrass because that's an important spiritual medicine in my people's culture. And so that kind of inspired me to put this shirt on from Section 35, which is an Indigenous company in Canada. I can't remember exactly where they're from. But yeah, and I spoke, so yeah, so I've been thinking about Elder Grouse a lot too, and his teachings really did have an impact on us, I believe, for sure. Adrian, do you want to go next?
Certainly. I think, yeah, why I wanted an elder to join us for the group, just to experience that. I've never really kind of have what we termed sort of like around our community sometimes is like olders. Like sometimes like an elder is a huge respect, and it's not necessarily something you're just kind of granted with age. Sometimes it takes I think a certain journey inward and to kind of find that. And I've heard of Elder Grouse, and I just immediately had so much respect. And so when there was an opportunity to have an elder, I was, really excited to hear their perspective. I think a lot of the learnings that they have gone through and learned from their youth and growing up is totally applicable to where we're at today. And so just to see that transition and to honor whatever knowledge they had to pass on, was just, would have been, I was really grateful for that time. So that was just ultimately it, was just to have the time to share with them, to see what they had to offer, and to see where that would go. So that's why I wanted them to join.
Awesome. Thank you, Adrian. Mitchell, do you want to go next?
Yeah. So, growing up in Indigenous, I know it's different for every person, every Indigenous person, but I've myself went to my fair share of like cultural events and stuff like that. And at these cultural events, there's usually elders and stuff like that. However, at least for me, it's always been more difficult to connect with elders on like a personal note, because they're just kind of there, but you don't want to have too much interaction with them. And so, for example, last year I went to .CACES, which is the Canadian chapter of ACES, which is the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. And so there's elders there, but you don't really have a connection or a personal connection with them. So I feel like having this opportunity to listen to their knowledge on a more personal level would kind of give that opportunity to connect more personally with an elder and learn their teachings from more personal level and more of a and more of an intimate level, rather than just kind of if they're talking to like a group, just being a blob in that group, more of a actual one-on-one. Even though it's like 7 of us, it's still kind of more of like a one-on-one versus just being in a group or being around them. So just more having their knowledge on more of a personal level.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you, Mitchell. Yeah. That's one thing that UBCO is great for. If you spend time in the Aboriginal Programs and Services Center, there's they bring in elders to sit down, and you can have more of that conversational style engagement that you don't necessarily get when you're at events and there's hundreds of people and one elder, right? So great. So in relation to that, what did you learn from the session with Elder Grouse? So we'll start with Adrian this time again, if you don't mind.
I think Quinn touched on a bit of that, just a sense of resiliency, humor, and honoring your journey. I know his story was really powerful, and had to really look within to find strength and lean on sort of this intuitive side of himself to find where he really wanted to go for a sense of direction. And I think that that really resonated with me, because at times it does seem all confusing and challenging at times. And just to hear that from an elder was really reassuring, that you can lean on Mother Nature or that intuitive self to kind of guide you through those tough times or questions that you might need answering, that the animals sometimes present themselves or situations, but it was just really neat to hear his perspective, and certainly brightened up my day for sure. So I was really grateful for that.
Yeah, because you spoke to the importance of connecting to Creator and all living things. It also spoke to them the way that animals can present themselves for message seeking, right, or for providing messages, and how that's when you're on the right path, right? And so that's could definitely see how that influenced some of our conversations after, where we were starting to take notice of those things a little more, from my perspective anyway. And I think it was you mentioned seeing an eagle a couple days after, or during our later sessions and stuff. So
Yeah.
Quinn, would you like to go next?
Yeah, kind of like what I said there is he provided us with many stories that were kind of very relatable. And, you know, he just talked about how Indigenous people are very loving people, and how he used to leave his door open and people would just come in, like friends would just come in and make themselves lunch, and he wouldn't mind at all. He wasn't even home, and he'd come home to an empty fridge and he'd be happy. So just goes to show that really compassionate and loving people, and to love one another. He talked about healing ways. I believe there was 4 healing ways: water, rose water, smudging, and sweating. And you know, when you find yourself in a hard situation, to just come back to those 4 elements, and just to bring you back to your roots. So it was really beneficial to have him there, and thankful for him to have some time to come talk to us.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Mitchell, do you like to go next?
Yeah, I don't want to cover anything that Adrian and Quinn said because I feel like I learned those things as well. But I feel like for me, it really applied to this group because I feel like he really touched on there's not like one way to be an Indigenous man, as long as you're kind of, you know, true to yourself. And I believe he mentions like removing the mask, something like that. Something like, yeah. As long as, and then that's, you know, as long as you remove the mask and be true to yourself like that, it's kind of how you be an Indigenous man. And obviously there's like the traditional things, you know, like respect and all that stuff. But yeah, also what stood out to me more so than learned is just the effect that the stereotypes had on Elder Grouse Barnes' life are still the ones present like today, especially in Indigenous men. They're still present today. I believe it was Ethan that had that story about trying to get a job at Tim Hortons and having like already kind of like his manager or whatever already having bad experiences with Indigenous people, and that reflected poorly on them, even though they hadn't really shown who they are. Same thing with Elder Grouse Barnes when he was a kid or a teenager or a young adult.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, he is specifically talking about the lazy stereotype that Indigenous people are seen as lazy, right? And how he had to combat that throughout his life. And that did relate to what Ethan and Ty had said about how someone in their life when they got a job had the preconceived notion of Indigenous peoples being lazy, and warned them not to be lazy before they even started their job. And so then that spoke to real life encounters that we're having, and to the ways these understandings are still present in society today. And throughout the group too, we did speak a lot about misrepresentations, and this presentation is focused on positive things mostly. We're not going into a lot of quote unquote more negative things. We talked about, we did have some pretty tough conversations about misrepresentations and trauma and settler colonialism and the ways it can affect Indigenous people's mental health. And that definitely did line up with well, Elder Grouse is saying, and I can kind of see that coming through with the stereotype that you mentioned. And even I believe it was Quinn who had mentioned at one point that seemed that the misrepresentations on digital media were different than kind of what Elder Grouse had mentioned about what it means to be an Indigenous man. And so for me personally, as a quote unquote researcher, running the study was something that kind of stuck in my mind for our discussion with Elder Grouse for sure. I'm just gonna quickly read a quote from Asher and then one from Ty that speaks to this as well. And then I believe we're getting close to the question and answer time. So what did you learn from the session with Elder Grouse? Asher mentioned that it was interesting how he uses spirituality to overcome some difficulties he's had in life instead of using modern medicine, and how modern medicine didn't really help Elder Gross a whole lot. But these traditional ways that Elder Gross spoke about definitely helped Elder Gross. So that's what Asher found interesting. And he said that we don't use traditional medicines in the hospital often, was kind of his signing off on that quote, speaking to his experience in nursing profession and the ways that Elder Gross spoke to the importance of our traditional Indigenous medicines and the ways that the 12-step program, for it was what he used as an example, just wasn't effective for Indigenous people. And so specifically Ty, he said, what stood out to me was his really strong resilience, just a rough childhood from what he described and maybe not so great adulthood. But, you know, he rose up to that and he apologized to the people he's hurt, and he's just a really tough guy. And so then I followed up with Ty and asked him what he meant by tough. And Ty mentioned he meant mental toughness. And we spoke about how that aligned to the traditional values of Indigenous men that Elder Gross spoke about being nonviolent and having big hearts, and that toughness in that instance didn't mean physical toughness. He wasn't really, you know, aggressive and strong. He was tough in that he was resilient, and he was grounding himself in traditional Indigenous values. So I'm just going to ask how much time we have left at this point.
We're at about 1 o'clock, and so we have a bit more time, and then we can move to comments or questions.
Okay, sounds good. We'll do one more question then, and then I'll get to the conclusion. So this question here. So how do you think participating in the group will impact your Indigenous masculine identity going forward? So Mitchell, if you don't mind starting.
Yeah, I feel like it will always, this project and all, you know, always thinking about being an Indigenous man will always kind of be in the back of my head now, because I found myself during the project, when I was on digital media and all that stuff, I always found like myself thinking about this project. So I feel like it will always be in the back of my head now, what it means to be Indigenous man. And I feel like, you know, through this project to kind of figure out that there's no like one right answer for this, for like, you know, what it means to be an Indigenous man. It's kind of like what you make of it. And then this experience kind of helped me put those thoughts together to kind of determine what it means to be an Indigenous man to myself. And I feel like as I go forward, I'll still keep thinking about that and, you know, kind of trying to be the best Indigenous man I can be in my own way. I feel like, you know, dealing with some things that, you know, that come up in your life and things in my life currently as an Indigenous man, and just kind of using this as kind of like the backbone or the structure of how to deal with those things and, you know, be the best Indigenous man I can be.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Mitchell. Thank you for your insight. It's great. Adrian, would you mind going next?
I'd be honored. I think that it's, yeah, really provided a sense of, I want to say security, but a sense of strength within myself that I can rely on, that it's putting my best foot forward, and that I don't have to try and live up to any expectation of what is in the media or what's maybe in the movies, that I'm completely unique as an Indigenous man. But ultimately, hearing the values and connecting with other Indigenous men that to me are peers that I find are really motivating to be better, that I can lean on them to sort of guide me along the way too, if I find myself wondering what's impacted me on social media or in life. that that there's other Indigenous men out there putting their best foot forward to try and make a better community for everyone out there. So that, to me, I think has really presented itself through this group, and by participating in it has really allowed me to explore that ideology, if you will, that it is so unique to be an Indigenous man, but we can, as a community and as a whole, come together to provide for a better sense of community. Yeah. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Adrian. Quinn?
Yeah, before this project, I was really searching what it meant to be Indigenous, and through this group, it's really helped me to kind of find my path into what it really means to be Indigenous. Talking with the guys and realizing that we're all kind of searching, trying to find it, but in a way we have found it, because just being, like what Mitchell said, just it's all so broad, and kind of like whatever makes you feel better. And as Elder Grouse said, connecting with nature and being compassionate with one another, and contributing to your community is all part of it. And I think in a way we've all kind of been doing that, and just naturally. And you know, it'd be what I see going forward, though, how I can contribute more to my Indigenous culture is learning more of the healing ways, as Elder Grouse outlined. And he really said, if you want to be more spiritually connected, to learn the language of your nation. And I thought that was really helpful, and I'll take that going forward, and hopefully I get to learn more of my Indigenous language. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Quinn. Great. Thank you for that insight, everyone. Yeah, I think we're going to call the round table there, and I'm going to get to the conclusion. I just want to thank each one of our group members that came here and participated in this presentation, and just in that conversation. That was so great. And then there will be a chance for questions and answers at the end of the presentation from the audience. So I'm just going to skip through this. Okay. So in conclusion, it is important to understand how digital media may be influencing young Indigenous men's identity, mental health, and wellness. And just given the long history of misrepresentation within media of Indigenous identities, it's important we empower young Indigenous men and Indigenous peoples more broadly to reclaim and reconstruct identities in relation to our traditional Indigenous cultures and the values and knowledge systems accompanying them. And so when doing this, gender identity and expressions are important to consider, as traditional Indigenous gender identities and expressions have been and continue to be disrupted and displaced through colonialism. And so digital media can act as a tool through which we accomplish the reconstruction of our Indigenous identities, as it can provide access to our cultures, communities, and knowledges, whilst providing space for the performance of indigeneity rooted in the imaginations of our people. So that speaks to the picture that was at the beginning of this PowerPoint, where when George Catlin and Carl Bodmore drew pictures of Chief Matatope, they did not align with the understandings of Indigenous masculinity that Chief Matatope had of himself. And that was evident when it was Kimberly Minor, 2015, where I'm pulling this information from. And so she said that it was evident in drawings from Chief Matatope that he drew himself, the differences in values that were put into those drawings. And so that speaks to the ways that our identities can be misrepresented when not told from our own perspectives. And that therefore it is very important that we are given as young Indigenous men, are given the space and authority to create and reconstruct our own identities in contemporary society. So in turn, this can help deconstruct misrepresentations of Indigenous peoples within digital media, and specifically with this project, Indigenous men and masculinities, and provide a framework for young Indigenous peoples to make sense of their lives and work towards positive mental health transformation in young Indigenous peoples. And so the framework I'm talking about is just from the literature on Indigenous identity, that Indigenous peoples' identity are important to health because it allows them to make sense of their life, essentially, in a meaning-making process is the term used for it. So that concludes our presentation, and we're here for questions and answering from the audience.
Great, thank you very much. Very interesting project. And so I invite participants to use the chat to make any comments or pose some questions to our panel. And I might just start it off with a few questions. So thank you again for sharing this project. And I want to thank everyone who participated, particularly Adrian, Quinn, and Mitchell for sharing your experiences in the group during this project. So can you just clarify for me, so the digital media, is this the actual group meetings over Zoom? Or when we talk about digital media, are we talking about, you know, what I find on the internet or what comes through on my Twitter or my other social media? Just help me understand how you're using the word digital media.
Yes, thank you for that question. Before I answer, should I stop sharing the slides and we just?
You can,
okay,
if you like, yeah.
It might be easier for me to see people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So digital media, we created a definition of digital media, and we probably should have put it up there now that you brought that up. But digital media for our group encompassed music, video games, news sites, social media, texting, emails. It was everything. And then originally we were going to run the group in person, but COVID happened and we had to do it through digital media. So that's where the Zoom came in.
I see.
And so, yeah, so the digital media was multiple layers. It was done through digital media, and it was about digital media,
Okay.
what we see on digital media, and
that
how it
helps a lot.
Yes.
So as I understand it, then through the group and Quinn, Mitchell and Adrian were part of the group, but also included other people. And as I understand it, the group met several times, 5 or 6 times, and you were facilitating the group, I understand. Is that right, Liam? Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so in each group, you then introduced various topics related to digital media. Is that what you did?
Yeah, so we started out very broadly with what is digital media like. And so then we defined digital media, and we talked about what does it mean to be an Indigenous man. And so those questions were used as prompts. And then our conversations, what we did was I took our conversations and I took quotes from them, and the group wanted to see our previous conversations. And so through an email, I sent out previous conversations we had. And so then the next group, we would talk about what we talked about the previous group, and we would go into more depth about it. So in that way, the group members were a part of the data analysis, because I would represent the data to the group and we would talk about it during that group. And then at any point that we had space that we needed to fill, because we were done our conversation related to the topic we had discussed, I would introduce a new topic. So one day we talked about gender. Yeah, and so that was introduced the third, but there was no structure of when it was introduced. No. The topics were introduced as needed, and it wasn't just one topic a group either. It was very unstructured in that way. And so our topics, if you look at it chronologically, weaved in and out, and conversations that we had would happen in session 1, that would be brought up again in session 3, session 4. And so it really was just kind of like that holistic conversational style, where we would draw on our memories and our previous conversations to guide future conversations.
No, that's great. That really helps me a lot. Thank you. So
No
we
problem.
do have some questions.
Mhm.
Virginie says, thanks, everybody. So we're getting some very great thanks. A question here. This might be slightly off topic, sorry, but do you think that Indigenous men's mental health is being accurately reported right now? And how would you encourage men who aren't honest with their mental health to share? And I think that reflects one of the comments I heard about taking off the mask. And but anyway, maybe I could open up to any of the panelists who might want to respond to that. And I'm not sure who wants to start. It's a good question.
I'm going to speak very quickly just about the reporting, because I think I would have the most understanding about reporting of mental health in Indigenous men. I can't necessarily say if it's accurate. From my understanding, is generally underreported because Indigenous men generally don't seek help for mental health. Indigenous peoples generally don't because of the structure of settler colonialism, and the ways that the healthcare system isn't structured to fit our needs. So that's just generally from the literature, what I understand that situation to be. And that's general to all Indigenous peoples, and I think may be more prevalent in Indigenous men, but I'm not 100%.
That's a good comment. I think you might be right. Does anyone else want to jump in on that question or add anything? So it is one of the approaches that I know about that encourages, I think, encourages Indigenous men to be honest about their mental health. And that is a program that has been started in Vancouver, but is spread to other areas of British Columbia, and that's the Dudes Club. It's not specifically, I don't know if you know about it, it's not specifically for young men, it's really for Indigenous men broadly. And it provides a safe place for Indigenous men. It's quite unstructured, like similar to these conversations that you had, but provides a safe place for men to come and interact with other men. And it's usually held in community settings versus clinical settings. And of course, if it's facilitated by typically Indigenous men themselves, and the topics are, if there is a discussion, and quite often there is, it's determined by the men who come, but other things are often offered at the Dudes Club, like where it started in the downtown east side of Vancouver. Men were offered haircuts, they were offered food, they ate together, and if they wanted to learn about various aspects of health, there was a physician who would just off the cuff kind of talk about this aspect of health. And one presentation I heard him talk about, he said that he thought by over the years that he had been hosting these Dude Club meetings, that they had probably covered every part of the body. But it also provided, and then he talked about how they encouraged, men who lived in the precarious situation of the downtown east side really had to be tough. And so he would encourage men to kind of leave their armor at the door and come into this safe place where they could feel safe, and not have to be overly protective. And over time, this program has become very well attended, and it also provided a way to link men with health services when they were ready to do that. And of course, on their own terms and so on. So it is a model where it might actually encourage men to be honest about their mental health because of the environment that's created. So that would be one example that I know about, but it's probably not the only one.
And just speaking to that, about that is in the literature, what it speaks to the way colonialism has favored hypermasculine identities, and those hypermasculine identities are present both within the general society and in digital media generally. And they're also, it's also evident the way that structure promoted those identities within Indigenous men. And because those ideals are more closely related to colonial understandings of what it means to be an Indigenous, or to be a man, and specifically an Indigenous man as well. And so that speaks to the facade, or the mask, is that this hypermasculinity, where manhood's associated with violence, is in stark contrast to our traditional values as Indigenous men, and that the understanding of men being violent as a natural product of our existence definitely hinders, our abilities, from my perspective, to reclaim and reconstruct identities connected to our values as Indigenous people.
No, I totally agree with you. I think if they had to be tough, it was because of the environment they were living in and
For sure.
residing in, as opposed to who they were. I agree. Lauren has a question. Thank you for such an important and captivating presentation. I'm curious if, given the benefits that come from this group and meeting together, are there plans to continue to meet or build on this work? I think that's also a really important question. Is this kind of framework, given your experiences, and some of the panelists might want to speak to that, is that a model that we could continue to use in the future to support young men and their masculinity identities, I guess?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question for sure, because I think all of us kind of hit a point right about a week ago where we're kind of going, well, this is bittersweet, because I mean, we're kind of a little sad that it's going to be ending from what we know, but also excited to kind of be at the stage where we can have some maybe a bit of data and some memories together that we have connected through all of this and gone through some interesting discussions. So from my perspective, I would love if something like this existed going forward, just to explore and welcome new members, like just welcome people and really have that community mindset. So if it is an option, I would totally be up for that.
That's great. Thanks, Adrian. Does anyone else want to chime in on that? I know in some of my own work with Indigenous fathers, when we brought Indigenous fathers together, and some of them might be new fathers, some of them had several children, didn't really matter. They really appreciated the opportunity to get together, because there weren't opportunities in their community to get together as fathers. And they really wanted to share ideas. And some of these men didn't have father models in their lives that they wanted to emulate. And so they were really grasping at trying to figure out how to be the fathers they wanted to be. And so being in a group provided them with this opportunity. So I can kind of see something similar happening with your group as well. It's not necessarily about being a father, but just being an Indigenous man, and what that might look like, and how men getting together can help each other figure that out. Not that there's one answer, obviously, but to explore the possibilities, because there are many masculinities, and they change within the kind of circumstances that people are in.
For sure. Yeah.
So any additional comments you want to make about the potential of continuing these kind of groups in the future? Let's call it on our campus, if not beyond.
Does anyone else have anything to say about that? No. Okay, I'll speak quickly.
Maybe.
Oh yeah, sure, Braden.
So I was just going to mention that sounds like a conversation that we could have with Aboriginal programs and services. And we had kind of intended it to be a first dig into what was going on, but the questions that are coming through, and many of the comments that have been made about a model for supporting men and men's well-being, that did really kind of resonate as something super important. So I definitely really appreciate that line of questioning, and that bringing guys together around something, whether it's digital media or if it's art or sport or language or whatever it might be, but then building in spaces that people can connect and dig into things does seem to be a really good model, and one where the participants themselves are driving. Like these are just many of the things that seem to me, based on our experiences, could be really important. So yeah, maybe we can bring that up at APS, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, sounds like a good idea.
Jane, maybe this is like too forward thinking, but I love the idea of something like that did exist on the campus, that that kind of young dudes club, if you want to call it, would be something that could be then taken back into the school district for those younger participants who might be thinking of making their way in life, whether that's university or college, or just trying to navigate life, and having those role models that are in your community, that there's an access to connect with them, I think would be fabulous.
Yeah, especially in schools. Well, even among first year university students, I mean, identity formation doesn't happen overnight, and so certainly in schools, kids are trying to figure out their identities, and I mean that continues long afterwards as people's roles change and their situation changes. So identity certainly isn't static, but yeah, maybe we could have a young dudes club here at UBCO. That would be great. We are nearly out of time. This has been really fabulous. I wonder if everyone, maybe I might invite you to have some closing comments. So maybe we could start with Liam. Any closing comments or words of advice?
Not really. I really appreciate coming here and speaking about the project today. I think we covered a lot of great things, and I don't know if I really have anything to add. I think a lot of the main points came through during this presentation, and I'm just really honored that there were people that came and watched and asked questions, and that we're all able to do this, and it's going to go up on YouTube, and that we're able to get kind of the word out. And I hope that this project is beneficial for all the group members joining it, and maybe it'll stem some research in their own lives and other research projects in that way, where they may take it up in their future careers and build off this experiences. Because I know at this point, I'm sure each one of them is more than qualified to run their own men's group at this point. So they could be running that group that we're discussing in the future. So for sure.
Well, that seems like a great place to end. So thank you very much to everyone for joining us today and sharing this project. And I'm just really proud of all the work that you're doing. This is great. It's just really wonderful to see the research that's going on at UBCO and the new approaches that are being tested and explored. So thank you once again. And you're right, this recording will be up on YouTube. And so once it is, we'll let people know, and certainly they can share it with others. And other people can view this presentation in the coming days. So thank you again. Have a great summer, everyone. Look forward to hearing more about this work as it unfolds.
Thanks so much.
For now. Thanks everyone for joining us too. Bye-bye.